What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. The time right now where I'm at is about 10:30 a.m. and today is March 13th, 2025, and we are returning to our Booked React series, picking up where we left off on Gregory D. Smithers' book, Slave Breeding, Sex, Violence, and Memory in African American History. I know all two of you have been waiting impatiently for the return of your boy back on the live streams. I've been gone for about a month, so apologies to all three of you who actually tune into this series and support this channel. And I want to say thank you to all of you for that. I've been very busy with work, with school, with life. Today is Acti's birthday, so all of you say happy birthday, Acti in the chat if you actually tune into this. And yeah, stay tuned for more content. I've been doing a lot of reading and independent study. As you know, I'm studying sociology out here in very white Budapest, Hungary. And so to protect my mind from the white man's technology, of course, I'm reading the required readings from school, but I'm also doing my own independent study. As you see, I read the book, Black and British by David Olusoga, did a review for that. We also did a review for Assata Shakur's autobiography. And right now, currently, I'm reading independently the autobiography of Angela Davis, which will be the next book that I will review independent of the Booked React series. So stay tuned for that. I'll try to do as many live streams as I can. My goal is to read at least one chapter a day on live for the people, for books that I have digitally stored here, but not in physical print. These books I more reflect on and then do a video on later. These books that I'm reading on live stream get more live reactions to the text. Right. So it's a different experience that you're going to be getting for that. And also stay tuned for the movie reviews that Acti and I are doing. We recently just did the Oscars for the first 100 films we watched. So go check out that live stream. That was fun. It's over 2.5 hours. We were having a great time chopping it up about all those films. And yeah, we're going to get back on our grind here on live stream, reading books, talking about the news, interacting with the people, and all that good stuff as we continue to grow and develop our minds and bring knowledge to the people. You get what I'm saying? So that's what we're doing here. And yeah, so like I said before, this is the book Slave Breeding by Gregory D. Smithers. This book I started last month for Black History Month. It was published in 2013. Gregory D. Smithers is an esteemed professor in the United States, and you can pick up this book on paperback for only $18.39 on Amazon. Get it before it's gone. This is not a paid advertisement at all, but I do encourage people to buy the books that we will be reading in the Booked React series, right? And this book here is about how slave breeding has been spoken about throughout history, right? And the previous chapters that we read showed that people that were pro-slavery talked about slave breeding in a certain way. People that were abolitionists against slavery spoke about slave breeding in a certain way. After the abolition of slavery, the memory of slave breeding was passed down through literature, through poetry, through media, through different ways, right? And now in chapter 4, we're going to be going to the theater of memory. And I believe this chapter is talking about how slave breeding was spoken about in the mid-20th century. So we're going to be getting into that, and let's jump in. So chapter 4, the theater of memory. In this world, Black women ain't nothing but breeders. To have chillins for the white folks, to sell them down river, like they do horses and cows. With these melancholic words, Mammy, a key actor in Randolph Edmonds' dialect drama, Breeders, 1930, exposed one of the deepest historical wounds in the collective memory of early 20th century Black Americans, the violent sexual exploitation of African American women during antebellum slavery. Edmonds used the trope of slave breeding to frame his protest against the racism and violence that white Americans directed against Black people. This was an era, it is worth remembering, when social Darwinian and eugenic discourse filtered through American culture and informed the nation's racism. When Black women who took jobs as domestics in white homes were vulnerable to sexual harassment and rape by white men. And when lynch mobs prematurely ended the lives of thousands of Black Americans, most of whom were men. So picking up right here, first of all, I did not know about this book or movie, Breeders. I would like to read it or see it or find it if it does exist. Let me know if you can find it or get a copy of it. Secondly, eugenics and social Darwinian stuff is what we are learning about a lot in sociology. And I always find it very troubling that my sociology professors never explicitly talk about how these eugenics programs, social Darwinian programs, Lamarckian ways of viewing human evolution were explicitly created, or if not created for, used against Black people, right? It's very disturbing. But let's continue here. In the 1920s and 30s, African-American men and women refused to let American racism go unchecked. These decades witnessed an outpouring of creativity and scholarly inquiry among African-American writers, intellectuals, and religious and civic leaders. We saw in the previous chapter how Black scholars crafted their own narratives of the past that aimed to challenge the hegemonic white culture's understanding of American history. Beginning in the 1920s, during a period known as the Harlem Renaissance, African-American writers and playwrights added their stories to a growing catalog of Black historical memories. These writers resisted efforts to sanitize the significance of slavery in American history and protested the racism and sexism that affected early 20th century Black Americans. Drawing on a tradition of oral storytelling, folk culture, and intellectual influence as diverse as Marx, Freud, and Gandhi, Black playwrights such as Randolph Edmonds wrote plays and musicals with both spiritual and material objectives in mind. They wrote to protest racial injustice and to inspire to redeem what they felt was the brutalized spirit of the African American people. And this is why I always say it's important for us as Black folks to tell our story, because if we don't tell it, they'll tell it for us. In small community-operated theaters, Black Americans explored these themes during the decades prior to World War II. From the Krigwa Players in New York to the Howard Players in Washington, D.C., the Olympian Players in Pittsburgh, and scores of other theaters in Black communities throughout the country, African-American performers recreated the past in all its joy and sorrow and presented searing commentaries on contemporary race relations. Local Black theater companies performed Randolph Edmonds plays, along with scores of other plays and musical dramas by Black playwrights such as Mary P. Burrell. Burrell's anti-lynching play Aftermath, 1919, was an example of the type of political protest being performed by Black theater companies. Aftermath focused on the fury of a white lynch mob, Burrell's underlying message being her condemnation of the burning and killing of Black bodies. And this is why I think, if you are a Black artist, or if you are critiquing the arts that are predominantly done by Black folks, like, for example, hip hop, right? There is an underlying political and social commentary that you're giving when you're doing Black art, whether you expect it to be there or not, and also when you are critiquing it as well, which is why I take my job as a writer for culturalist theory very seriously, because we are engaging in Black studies when we are ranking the catalogs of these artists, right? Let's continue here. Black playwrights like Edmonds and Burrell refused to turn a blind eye to brutalities that white Americans had visited and continued to visit on African American people. Their protests joined those of Black scholars and increasingly vocal generation of Black political protesters, such as Ida B. Wells, who campaigned against lynching and sought ways to protect Black women from the threats of sexual assault in the workplace. This chapter explores the seemingly unconnected histories of slave breeding and lynching in the work of Black playwrights, focusing in detail on the works of Edmonds and Burrell. The chapter begins with an overview of the racial context of early 20th century America, the very real theater of Southern lynching, in an effort to highlight the ways in which Black playwrights of this period place the history of lynching or wrongful death into a broader historical context. I demonstrate how the history of slave breeding or the coercive creation of life was connected to contemporary racial concerns in the theatrical imaginations of Burrell and Edmonds. What follows, therefore, is a textual analysis of how Burrell and Edmonds crafted narratives with Black audiences in mind. Like their contemporary Black playwrights, they hoped that their work would eventually be performed for Black theater audiences and help to cultivate a collective political response to American racism. Burrell and Edmonds epitomize how African American playwrights felt such political objectives could be achieved by exploring the emotional and historical connections between sex, slavery, and violence in American history. So I assume the text Breeders that was mentioned in the first paragraph is a play because I think it's written by Edmonds as well. Very interesting to see what happens here. Let's continue. Slavery in American popular culture. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, African Americans from different class, gendered, and educational backgrounds spoke or wrote about the connection between the reproduction of life and the destruction of human existence in Black history. Slavery was often the starting point for narrative explorations of the interconnected themes of life and death in Black culture. In slavery, Black men and women were socially and legally non-beings. The desire to borrow from one of Langston Hughes' suggestive poems for the love of a husband or wife and the affection of a parent for their child or children rested on the power of the slave owner. Alternatively, the sanctity of an enslaved couple's love could so easily be breached by the desire, be it for sexual gratification or profit, of the white slave owner and slave trading classes. Profound feelings of fear and anxiety, anger and frustration thus punctuated Black literary and dramatic explorations of history and memory during the early 20th century. I mean, within any type of Black art, I would assume there is this sort of existentialism that lies underneath it. Like, what does it mean to exist as a Black person, right? And all the things that are related to existence, such as love, hate, hope, fear, right? They're under question when you are Black in this world, and especially if you're living under the conditions of slavery or, apartheid. Let's continue here. In contrast, white readers and theater audiences found comfort in renderings of the past that marginalized African American characters and depicted slaves as easygoing and good-natured. Such characterizations existed well into the 20th century, with comic watermelon-eating Negroes becoming a staple of popular culture. From Belle Lamar, an episode of the Civil War, 1874, to His Trust and His Trust Fulfilled, both 1911. The depiction of loyal and happy slaves on one hand and comedic and bumbling N-words on the other united Northern and Southern whites in the shared self-deception that was lost cause mythology. I have to say N-words because YouTube demonetizes my videos when I say the N-word. For some reason, even though I'm Black as hell. Can't you tell? Can't you tell? Anyway, for native-born white and immigrant audiences alike, the melodramatic capstone of America's historic retelling of slavery and the Reconstruction era came not on the stage, but with D.W. Griffith's film, The Birth of a Nation, 1915. Griffith described The Birth of a Nation as an overwhelming compilation of authentic evidence and testimony. The Birth of a Nation highlighted the cultural hegemony that white Americans maintained over the presentation of memories about slavery and the Reconstruction era. Indeed, the melodrama portrayed in The Birth of a Nation inspired President Woodrow Wilson himself, a professional historian, to speak on behalf of the nation when he famously quipped that Griffith's movie was like writing history with lightning. On the stage or silver screen, then, the white public's imagination was captured by a historical narrative that celebrated the rebirth of a nation from the ashes of internecine war and trivialized or erased scenes of Black exploitation and suffering at the hands of their white forebears. I was thinking about reviewing Birth of a Nation with acting. And I wanted to do both, the original Birth of a Nation and then watch Nate Parker's Birth of a Nation afterwards and do both of those reviews. I decided against the original Birth of a Nation because it's close to 3 hours long and it's a silent film. But it's something I do want to watch. And also speaking about how they trivialized Black suffering, I plan on reading Uncle Tom's Cabin and Gone with the Wind. And I know both of those books were written by white women, right? So I'm very interested to see if in those books they actually trivialize slavery and make it seem not so bad. Looking forward to that. Let's continue here. Black Americans were not moved to accept unexamined historical platitudes by such culturally constructed self-deception. Faced with romanticized theatrical and cinematic portrayals of slavery and confronting the daily realities of lynching and de jure segregation, the NAACP's crisis editorialized that while Black Americans have a history they should not be ashamed of, they will wait a long, long time for white men to write this history in all fairness for the consumption of the great white public. Unwilling to wait passively for this day to come, turn of the century Black playwrights joined African American scholars in challenging a national culture that preferred historical amnesia on issues such as slavery and favored obfuscation on the racial dimensions of rape and lynching. So yeah, once again, this goes to what I talked about before. Like, we have to tell our stories, because if we wait for the white man to tell how slavery really went down, how Jim Crow really went down, how the new Jim Crow is really going down, how post-colonialism in Africa is really going down, we're going to be waiting 1,000 years when Black folks are extinct, and then they say, man, what we really did was wrong. You get what I'm saying? So we have to tell our stories, and we have to advocate for ourselves. Let's continue here. Black playwrights addressed what they saw as the narrative continuities between pre and post Civil War America. Early African American productions such as The Creole, 1891, The Octoroons, 1895, and Oriental America, 1896, fused elements of minstrelsy and vaudeville entertainment into Black theatrical reinterpretations of slavery and its historical legacy. Black playwrights thus gave renewed meaning to memories of enslavement and an era of terrifying racial violence. Lynching and the ever-present threats of rape among Black female domestics were the emblems of white supremacist violence in Jim Crow America. They were, as Black playwrights insisted, with increased clarity, examples of white masculine attempts to reassert male dominance over an interracial society. From Klansmen, white working class men, and the most respected patriarchs of the New South, these perpetrators of lynching aimed to reinstitute a cultural code of conduct that approximated the disciplined social lines that had once defined community life under slavery. With slavery abolished, white men used the physical and psychological terror of lynching to restage white supremacy in a very public fashion. In the process, the antebellum forces on Black reproductive exploitation shifted. While white men continued to view Black women as objects of sexual exploitation, their avowed aim became the protection of white womanhood from Black male rapists. The slave men who once sired Black children now became the objects of lynchings and castration, lest the descendants of these young bucks rape white women, pollute the white race, and produce children who blurred the lines of racial privilege beyond recognition. As psychologist John Dollard famously observed in his 1937 study of Indianola, Mississippi, there was a general white belief that the Negro not only possessed a larger penis than men of other races, but is capable of maintaining it in a state of erection for a longer period than is possible for a male of any other race. The very qualities that made the slave buck an ideal breeding machine. In freedom, however, these stereotypically racist qualities made Black men unmitigated threats to white womanhood and white male supremacy. Going now to this picture here. This is from the NAACP anti-lynching campaign. In the picture, we see here what looks like a Black woman who cut down a Black man who is hanging from the tree, and she is crying out in agony as he lays dead on the floor. Just going real quickly to like the sexual stereotypes and schemas that existed around Black men at this time. You know, we covered this in our book that we read from Martha Hode's Black Men, White Women, Illicit Sex in the 19th Century South, that before slavery ended, the relationship between the Black man in the South and the white man and the white woman in the South was tenuously held by tacitly accepting some sexual relationships between Black men and white women. As we saw in Martha Hode's book, it happened quite a lot. There were a lot of instances of Black men marrying white women, reproducing with white women, having sexual liaisons with white women, and white men at the time saw this as just the cost of doing business. There was no castrations, no rampant lynchings, no beating up a Black man until his eyes pop out of his socket for whistling at a white woman, like back in the apartheid Jim Crow days, right? And basically it all sort of changed after the end of slavery because they have to maintain white male patriarchy and hegemony, right? So then that's when we start to see all these transformations in the minds of white men in relation to how they view Black men, right? And also how they want to police the relationships between white women and Black men. It's a very interesting book. You should go check out the series from Martha Hode's. From Martha Hode's book. It's not hard to find. It's in the playlist on this channel. White America's obsession with Black sexuality in the century after the Civil War, be it in the sexual harassment and rape of Black women or the obsession with the Black man's genitalia, was in its projected outcomes different. During slavery, the semi-naked and naked bodies of enslaved laboring women were the focus of white violence and exploitation for reproductive purposes. Enslaved women lived with the threats of sexual violence, the public auction of slave family members, and the fear that male loved ones would become victims of violence or permanently separated from them. As most early 20th century African Americans saw things, these types of threats remained. They existed in the form of rape and lynching. In the collective historical consciousness of early 20th century African Americans, an awareness of how Black people had long constituted figures of the white public's exploitation, control, and scorn pervaded the theater of historical memories and anti-lynching activism. In her expose of lynching, Ida B. Wells, one of the bravest and most vocal opponents of lynching, made the connection between slavery and freedom, the rape of Black women, and the lynchings of African American men. During the slave regime, Wells argued, the Southern white man owned the Negro body and soul. It was to his interest to dwarf the soul and preserve the body. Wells asserted that following the Civil War, emancipation gave birth to a new system of intimidation. The Negro was not only whipped and scourged, he was killed. Wells, like other members of Black communities throughout the United States, knew that there was a link between rape and lynching. She attempted to lift the veil of ignorance about this connection among white Americans, insisting that when a white man rapes a Black woman, nobody is lynched and no notice is taken. White Americans were, by Wells' reckoning, sexual and racial hypocrites, the apologists for lynchers of the rapists of white women only. It was the lynching of Black men, however, that gained the most public attention during the early 20th century. Examples abounded in the Black press. Wells reported that in one case, a crowd of around 10,000 witnessed the burning of a lynching victim's legs and feet. She explained that after this sadistic immolation, the hot irons, plenty of fresh ones being at hand, were rolled up and down Smith's, the victim's stomach, back, and arms. Then the eyes were burned out and irons were thrust down his throat. Jesus Christ, this is horrible. Oh, it's so sick. Sadism, torture, and castration became the signature features of the lynch mob's repertoire of torture. Shout out to Ida B. Wells as well. She was such a brave woman. All my icons are heroes. All my heroes are sheroes. All my heroes are sheroes. Angela Davis, Assata Shakur, Ida B. Wells, just real women. You get what I'm saying? Who like stood on business and like really put their lives on the line to advocate for our people and to create a better world for all of us, as in all humans. Continuing here. While sadistic acts of branding and burning could be found in the slave South, the castration of Black men after the Civil War carried with it a very explicit meaning. Lillian Smith, a prominent white Georgian and opponent of segregation, lamented that the castration of lynching victims was born of a savage fury and a stern resolve to strike a deeper terror into those whom the other method had failed to awe. The terror and mutilation inflicted on so many lynching victims had both physical and psychological motivations. Castration took from its victim the capacity to reproduce and, if the victim survived, a critical physical component of Black male identity. Unless the Black community failed to recognize the intent of such lynchings, local authorities often ordered family members to collect the remains of a loved one. This was the case for August Turner, the father of a lynching victim, who was summoned to the park to remove his son's charred remains in 1921. I mean, what is the purpose of having public executions? Number one, it's to send the message to society that we don't condone this type of activity, but it's also to send the message to a specific people that this can happen to you. Do you not abide by these morals, rules, and laws, right? Whether they be double standards or not. And so I think also by having these public executions, it was a way of bonding people as well, by saying they're not like us, essentially. And we can do this to them, and this is deserving of what happens to them, right? Let's continue here. African American playwrights drew upon these terrifying tales to critique the rationale behind lynching. The accusation of the Black male rapist, so often repeated to justify the lynching and mutilation of Black men, was the object of both commentary and satire in productions such as Georgia Douglas Johnson's A Sunday Morning in the South, 1925. African-American women like Johnson wrote most of the anti-lynching plays during the early 20th century. Their works were performed at community-based nonprofit venues that offered alternatives to a predominantly white, male, and New York City-centered theater. Johnson recognized that while the rape or attempted rape of a white woman was often cited as a catalyst for a lynching, blacks knew that whites generally lynched people for any number of arbitrary reasons, and that the most likely victims of rape, black women, rarely figured in public debates about sexual abuse. And we see remnants of this today because I believe no white man has ever been executed in the United States for the rape of a black woman. But several black men have been executed by the state. And I'm talking about official death row, prisoners, right? Many black men have been executed by lethal injection, firing squad, electric chair, hanging, etc., for the rape of a white woman. But no white man has had the same thing happen to him, even though several white men have been found guilty and convicted of raping black women through the official court system. Now, I'm not talking about street justice like lynchings and stuff like that. Let's continue here. The black woman who wrote lynching plays understood the implications behind the long and explosive history of interracial sex in the United States. Some playwrights, such as Myrtle Smith Livingston, recognized the sexually charged anger that white lynch mobs directed against black men, irrespective of the baseless nature of charges of sexual impropriety. In For Unborn Children, 1926, Livingston presented a cautionary tale about the dangers of miscegenation. Intermarriage, Livingston has her characters explain, hurts the Negro race. One of these characters, Grandma Carlson, explains that when a colored man marries a white woman, he hurts every member of the Negro race. As we will see in the next chapter, some former slaves shared similar views. The painful history of sexual violence against black people inspired Livingston to urge African Americans to forget the past, to especially forget about ideas of interracial marriage, and to move into a future characterized by a proud Negro race. Now, there are multiple reasons why there might be black people who are against interracial marriage. First and foremost, they might believe that's not right. They believe in race essentialism, that somebody is black, somebody is white. They believe these are core to our identity and they existed before colonization and slavery and that sort of stuff, and they're not social constructs. Somebody might believe that, and therefore they might say, we need to protect our race, whatever that might be, even though race is amorphous and changes from space to place and stuff like that. There's that. Some people might say also that a lot of black people disapproved of interracial marriages, or still disapprove of interracial marriages, because they notice the inherent danger within them, right? Let's keep it frank and let's keep it a buck, right? There is a high possibility that if you pick the wrong woman, right, of any race, that woman can turn against you, right? The number one killer of partners in relationship is the other partner, right? And so, if you're a black man in a relationship with a white woman, she has the possibility, and we're seeing this now with some black men in America who have been murdered by their white baby mamas and girlfriends and wives. She could kill you and walk away scot-free. You get what I'm saying? Or she could have the police come and kill you and get away scot-free, right? And also on top of that, in the inverse, if you're a black woman, marrying a white man, right? There's a high possibility that he might, degrade you through language, right? Especially if he's a white American man. And also men, not trying to categorize us or stereotype us, but a lot of men commit violence against women, right? And it's very likely that white man were to commit a heinous act of violence, even murder, against his, black partner. There's a high probability he should get off or get a lighter sentence and stuff like that as well. And sometimes people just don't want the heat on the community as well, right? Like if there's a community of black folks living in the Jim Crow South and one guy brings home this white girl to the community, they don't want Black Wall Street to happen. They don't want a bunch of mad white folks coming down to the neighborhood, burning down houses and shooting children and stuff like that, just because you want to smash a big booty pog in Mississippi. You get what I'm saying? Anyway, continuing here. This was no easy task, as Georgia Douglas Johnson's 1926 drama Blue Blood helped to explain. Blue Blood, first performed by New York's Krigwa Players, portrayed an African-American couple who discover that they share the same white father. Using the narrative devices of miscegenation, incest, and color-conscious class pretensions in African American communities. Blue Blood reflected the difficulty of forgetting the violent and coercive history that often lay at the heart of racial identity and Black-white sexual relations. Early 20th century Black Americans could not forget this history because they were still living it. That's an ill story. I want to read that book or watch that play. Man, we got to find some of these old plays from centuries ago. Like, actually, this is about 100 years ago, man. So yeah, somebody find Blue Blood. We're going to look up Blue Blood, the play, and see if we can read it. And I'm going to read Slave Play. I tell myself this every year. We're going to read Slave Play on Livestream. We're going to read Slave Play. I promise I'm going to read it this year. I have to read Slave Play and react to it. Anyway, Black playwrights and the production of historical memory. Anti-lynching dramas belong to an era in which all Americans felt deep anxiety about the racial implications of interracial sex and sexuality. Historians and cultural studies scholars have also observed that the forces of modernism heightened these anxieties. In the North, the New South, and the West, a growing American preoccupation with consumerism, leisure, and a new permissiveness emerged. For white Americans, the forces of modernism evoked both optimism about the economic future of the republic and pessimism about the frailties of the United States' racial future. On the American stage and screen, images of bumbling, fried chicken eating Sambos reassured white audiences that Blacks remained subordinate and distant from mainstream society. These same audiences were cautioned, however, not to let down their guard and open the door to social equality and its inevitable final act, race suicide. By the 1910s and 20s, W.D. Griffith's silent movie, The Musketeers of Pig Alley, the romantic comedy The Flapper, 1920, and Rachel Crowther's play Nice People, 1921, presented audiences with cautionary tales of immigrant gangsters and teenage girls overindulging in the consumeristic and interpersonal excesses of the quote-unquote flapper. Social commentaries from the likes of former President Theodore Roosevelt to the eugenicist Madison Grant warned that such material indulgences should not be enjoyed at the expense of the reproduction of a vibrant, intelligent, and pure white American race. Set against the social and cultural background, it made perfect sense for white playwrights and movie producers to either marginalize or demonize Black characters as the plot line demanded. Very interesting to see how the creation of modern media at the early 20th century coincided with these Black stereotypes that they were also putting out there as well. It's like they had to create a sort of mimesis. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, or making it a mimetic quality, like a meme-like quality to transmit anti-Blackness through these new forms of media, right? Anyway, continuing here. African-American playwrights and audiences were also influenced by eugenic discourse, but in a way that reflected a different historical subjectivity. For example, Myrtle Smith's Livingston's anti-lynching play for unborn children, 1926, structured its narrative around the idea of race pride and the author's conviction that interracial marriage hurt Black communities more than it harmed whites. Recent scholarship has also noted the popular uses of eugenic discourse among African Americans. The historian Michelle Mitchell demonstrates how popular theories of eugenics influence Black analyses of intergroup vitality. The early 20th century memories of former slaves who insisted, as historian Mary Jenkins Schwartz has shown, that slaveholders expected to appropriate and exploit the reproductive lives of enslaved women, resulted in African Americans incorporating the language of popular eugenics to emphasize the importance of sexual morality, the judicious selection of a marriage partner, and family cohesion. So first and foremost, I want to say it's so annoying how some plays in this book are mentioned and he doesn't explain the narrative, right? Like, tell us the story of 4 unborn children. Like, how is the author of that play making the argument that interracial marriages are worse for Black folks than white folks, right? It's a very interesting argument. I would like to hear it. That's the point of making it, right? But tell us briefly in one sentence the story. Secondly, I think it's also very interesting that Black folks would adopt the talking points of eugenics, right? That it's good to have good racial hygiene, select the right partner of your own race. but it's coming from the perspective of that, you know, we were raped and made to be breeding machines for so long, particularly by white men, right? That there is sort of this aversion to interracial relationships and sexual liaisons, because that resulted in so many, you know, bastard children, children getting sold off away from their parents, maybe accidental incestuous relationships happening because parentage from white folks was unsure in certain people, right? And so they end up getting with their brother or sister, like so many things. So it comes from a more from the vantage point of the white folks who are pushing eugenics. They're pushing for maintaining white supremacy. In the perception From the perception of the black folks who are pushing eugenics, it's about maintaining, you know, social cohesion in the face of anti-black bias. So yeah, continuing here. The emergence of black theater companies in the early 20th century aimed to rectify the racist portrayal of African Americans on stage and screen. Black theater companies combined high and lowbrow aesthetics, fusing minstrel humor, modern dance, ragtime music, divergent styles, and burlesque, along with parodies of race, class, and gender. The productions that these theater companies staged also reminded black actors and audiences that the legacies of slavery endured in the racial politics of the Jim Crow era. Black theater performers used parody, a performative style that provided audiences with a politicized theatrical statement that subtly encouraged resistance against white historical accounts of slavery and early 20th century race relations. The past and the present, the comedic and the dramatic, all of these elements were fused together in the black theater. Musical productions such as In Dahomey, 1902 to 1905, Abyssinia, 1906 to 1907, and Bandana Land, 1907 to 1909, combined comedy, satire, and historical reconstruction to present an African-American interpretation of Black history that stretched from early modern Africa to the Jim Crow South. In scores of nonprofit, community-based theater companies, African-American stage productions that dealt with a diverse range of historically interconnected issues that included the Middle Passage, sexual exploitation during slavery, and rape and lynching in Jim Crow America. The scope of Black theater and musical productions was as diverse as Black social, cultural, and intellectual life itself. We need to bring back some of these plays, man, because we need to see them. I think these are fascinating, right? And you know, the theater is one of those art forms or mediums of artistic expression that still remains so exclusionary and so elusive to most folks. I really think if you have a play, y'all should videotape it. At least one copy, at least one videotaped copy of every play should be made, right? So that people can see it outside of the theater, because we don't all have access to the theater. Most people never go to the theater, and most people, you know, I would also argue, go to the theater maybe once or twice in their life, if ever. You get what I'm saying? So yeah, they need to make these things more available. And I know back in 1902 and 1909, like people didn't have cameras, right? But like modern films, modern Black films, and modern Black plays that are done on stage should be recorded, right? How come I can see Hamilton, but I can't see Slave Play? I want to see Slave Play. I want to see Slave Play, not Hamilton. You get what I'm saying? Anyway, none of these theatrical recreations would have been possible had it not been for the creativity of Black playwrights. Mary P. Burrell's Aftermath, 1919, for example, epitomized the thrust of this creative spirit. Born in Washington, D.C. in 1884, Burrell attended the M Street School, which became Dunbar High School in 1929. She earned her Bachelor of Literary Interpretation degree from Emerson College, Boston. Burrell published only 2 of her plays, Aftermath and They That Sit in Darkness, both published in 1919. During her lifetime, Burrell's energies were channeled into her work as a teacher and director, both students and colleagues agreeing that she was an inspirational mentor. Burrell's 2 published plays, however, highlighted her strength of mind and political convictions born from the racial realities of Black life in white supremacist America. They That Sit in Darkness, for example, was a pro-birth control play that reflected Burrell's anguish for African-American motherhood. Aftermath also addressed themes of Black motherhood, in addition to tackling themes such as African American masculinity, family fragility, and nationalism. The opening scene, set in the Thornton cabin in South Carolina, depicts slavery in all but name. In the dreary postbellum setting, Ma'am Sue, an old woman, and Millie, a slender brown girl of 16, are engaged in domestic chores. The burning logs in the cabin's fireplace crackle and split apart, offering the audience a prophesied vision of events to come. Indeed, we learn that Ma'am Sue lost her husband to a lynch mob, his body desecrated on a savage pyre. All seed evil doings. Mom Sue informs Millie of the night her husband, Millie's father, was lynched. The splitting log jolts Ma'am Sue's memory, and she informs Millie that she told yo po daddy to keep away from town, the next day with his cotton. Okay, I hate that he's writing it this way because, okay. So the mama told her daughter that she told her daddy to keep away from the town the next day with cotton. I guess he was selling cotton or something like that. On the tragic night, God spoke to Ma'am Sue through the cabin fire, just as he had spoken to her. Millie, however, is unmoved by her mother's prophecy. According to Millie, the Lord forgot us colored people. All right. He wrote here, the Lord's done forgot us po colored folk. I mean, God forgot about us Black folks. He doesn't care about us, is what, Millie responded to her mother, right? Anyway, amid the mother-daughter conversation, news of John's homecoming from World War I battlefields of Europe reaches the cabin. John is Ma'am Sue's son and Millie's brother. He has no knowledge that his father died at the hands of a lynch mob. After expressing his joy to be home, John offers audiences an explanation for why he fought. He recalls that lots of times in the trenches when I was dog-tired and sick and aching with the cold, I used say, well, if we're suffering all this time for the oppressed, like they tell us, then Ma'am Sue and Dad and Millie come in on that. They'll get some good out of it if I don't. So essentially what he's trying to say is like he went to fight in World War I because he wants to fight for freedom. And if he dies and doesn't get it, then at least his family will get freedom because he sacrificed his life for the country. And that's going to magically make white folks appreciate Black folks somehow. Anyway, John, having been trained to perform his duty and fight for democracy and freedom, presents a masculine version of Millie's suspicion about the futility of religion. While not shunning God, John is quick to observe that beyond a certain point, prayer ain't no good. Burrow thus crafts a powerful scene in which a divide over the importance of religious faith and the utility of direct political and military protest was developing along distinct generational lines. It was an emerging generation of young Black men and women, both on stage and off, who refused to be intimidated by white supremacy and lynch mobs during the interwar period. John symbolizes this generation. Unwilling to hide his World War I pistols, John receives the news of his father's lynching. They burnt him down by the big gum tree. Inadvertently, his sister explains that he had gotten into a row with old Mister about the price of cotton. So basically, the father got killed because he fought with a white guy about selling cotton. For his impudence to a white man, John's father lost his life in the most brutal way imaginable. John, who is especially close to his father, is enraged by this news. He complains bitterly that while I've been helping the white man get his freedom, they burning and killing my folks here at home. To hell with them. In the final dramatic scene, John declares, I ain't scared of none of them. I've faced worse guns than they sneaking hounds can show me. To hell with them. In haste, John leaves the cabin and disappears in the gathering darkness. The audience is left to ponder his fate. Like many other anti-lynching melodramas, such as Ralph Edmonds' Bad Man, Burroughs' Aftermath did not confine itself to issues of Black masculinity, family fragility, and nationalism in the interwar years. It both addressed and represented a rising generation of Black Americans determined to seek redress for history's ills and to attack the core expression of early 20th century racism, lynching. Thus, by the 1920s and 1930s, African American playwrights had committed themselves to framing both history and contemporary racial issues in increasingly political terms. This effort received a jolt of creative energy from the writers, actors, and activists associated with the Harlem Renaissance. It is important not to overstate the historical significance of the Harlem Renaissance. Indeed, during the height of the Harlem Renaissance, African Americans owned and operated only 157 of the nation's 5,000 theaters. Nonetheless, in their commentaries on race and the legacy of slavery, and in their critique of rape and lynching, the work of Black playwrights presented both profound and rare public expressions of how Black Americans lived with the legacy of slavery. One of the more politically oriented theatrical movements of the 1920s was the Black Little Theater movement. This movement originated among Harlem Renaissance intellectual luminaries such as W.E.B. Du Bois, Alain Locke, Jesse Fawcett, and James Weldon Johnson. In the 1922 essay, Steps Towards the Negro Theater, Locke explained the motivation for the formation of the movement. He claimed that its members were driven by a desire to stage productions that avoided excesses of commercialism in preference for a type of race drama that would eventually become peculiarly the ward of our colleges as new drama, as arts drama, and as folk drama. Locke and the Little Black Theater movement thus felt driven to project the voices and experiences of ordinary Black Americans by promoting folk culture in their writing and in theater houses. And what I understand by folk culture, it's more like what we would say is ghetto Black Americans today, right? Like, or in this case, rural Black folks in the South with not a lot of education who speak like us po Black folks is show lost gods chilling, stuff like that. You know what I'm saying? That's what I understand by folk culture, but maybe there's a better explanation here. Whether Locke and the Black Little Theater movement successfully promoted African American folk culture is a matter of ongoing scholarly debate. What is more important is the voice that the movement attempted to give to ordinary Black Americans. In productions such as Willis Richardson's The Deacon's Awakening, 1920, Florney Miller and Aubrey Lyle's Shuffle Along, 1921, Zora Neale Hurston's Color Struck, 1925, Marita Odette Bonner's The Purple Flower, 1928, we see on stage and hear in the dialogue the memory of slavery, the fear of lynching, and the often biting, sometimes funny, treatment of racial and sexual stereotypes. From reflective portrayals of sexism and male chauvinism in The Deacon's Awakening, Hurston's exploration of color prejudice among African Americans in Color Struck, and Bonner's overt call for social and cultural revolution in The Purple Flower, Black playwrights and the theater productions they helped to create during the 1920s refused to avoid tensions between slavery and freedom. One of the most prolific and influential African-American playwrights to address the memory and legacy of slavery was Ralph Edmonds. Edmonds was a professor of English and director of dramatics at Morgan College. Born on April 30th, 1900, Edmonds came to be known as the Dean of Black Education Theater. He provided Black actors with roles that explored the depths of African-American humanity, connecting modern encounters with racism with the dark recesses of American slavery. Edmonds wrote the types of melodramas and comedies that Eulalie Spence called for in her 1928 essay, A Criticism of the Negro Drama. Spence urged Black playwrights to portray the life of their people, their foibles, their sorrows, ambitions, and defeats, that these portrayals be told with tenderness and skill and a knowledge of the theater and the techniques of the time. Basically, keep it real, keep it Black, and keep it raw, but also know what you're doing. Like, be talented and it's easy to say just be talented, but actually take the craft seriously of writing plays is what I assume he's saying, but also keep it real, right? Edmonds' work embodied both Spence's call and Locke's theatrical vision. Edmonds produced a rich archive of plays and prose that shed a sliver of light on the life, memories, and feelings of Black Americans during the early 20th century. By his own admission, however, Edmonds was slow to appreciate the power of Black history in early 20th century America. Reconciling himself to the importance of engaging with Black America's history, he grew to appreciate the work of the African-American historian Carter G. Woodson. Addressing the complexities of African American history, Edmonds acknowledged the profound cultural and political purpose of his work in an overtly racist society. In 1949, he made an unequivocally clear statement about why it was important for Black playwrights and artists to contest the historical distortions in white popular culture. All the multiplicity of books of whatever type, from Gone with the Wind, forward or backwards, runs to the same pattern. There is the big house or mansion with its courtly slave master or owner after 1865, and his wife, a pure and majestic Southern belle. There are the slaves or workers' quarters of dilapidated cabins with varied types of Negro stereotypes. Among these are the full bosom mammy or cook, subservient plantation uncles, banjo and guitar playing minstrels or buffoons, loyal servants of the big house, half-wits, elders, free and easy sensuous women, voodoo characters, thieves, rogues, and bad men. All of these speak a dialect that is sometimes humorous and at other times full of poetic beauty and truth. The whole is overlaid with the psychological element of superiority of the whites and the rightness of the Negro's place as hewers of wood and drawers of water. Basically, what he's saying here is what I say all the time, right? If we let white folks tell our story, we're going to come out looking like buffoons, ridiculous stereotypes and caricatures of us, and the implicit notion that you'll get from white retellings of our story is that somehow we are inferior, right? Which is important for us to tell our stories and also tell very Black stories in a way that resonates with us to our soul. You get what I'm saying? And also speaks truth to power in the sense that we're not perfect. We are deeply flawed, but that is because of our humanness and not because of our Blackness. Continuing here. Edmonds' critique of these self-delusional and historical misrepresentations of mainstream white culture bespoke the ongoing legacy of racial slavery in 20th century America. Through repetition and a willful manipulation of Black folk culture, white culture makers presented a history that not only looked back longingly on the days of slavery, but strove to recreate it. So how did Edmonds imagine that the theater might be used to produce a counter-narrative to the racial stereotypes and historical misrepresentations in mainstream popular culture? He used, not coincidentally, dialect dramas. Dialect dramas were often criticized for reinforcing racial stereotypes of Negroes as profane, shiftless, and exotic. Edmonds disagreed. He defended dialect dramas as a medium through which the sorrows, ambitions, and defeats of Black American life and history could be presented on the stage. Edmonds aimed to tap into the nobler qualities of Black folk culture and to find and celebrate heroic Black characters amidst the racist and pejorative imagery that pervaded American mainstream culture during the early 20th century. Dialect dramas allowed Edmonds to explore the central concern in African American folk culture, the struggle for existence, particularly among Black working class families. Here, the fragile balance between the reproduction of life and the inevitability of death came into focus. None of Edmonds' plays highlight this tension better than Breeders, 1930, a deeply moving play that explores the fragility of life for the enslaved and the specter of slave breeding on the antebellum plantation. Carter Woodson found himself so taken by Breeders that he offered Edmonds his highest praise, referring to his work as historical. Throughout the Great Depression, African American theater companies presented Edmonds' slice of history to African American audiences across the country. From the Morgan Players in Baltimore, the Olympian Players in Pittsburgh, the Columbia Experimental Little Theater in Ohio, and the Players Guild at Dillard University in New Orleans, Black theater companies staged productions of this historically wrenching and politically confrontational play. In presenting Edmonds' Breeders on the stage, Black performers brought to life those traumatic stories of slavery that the elderly spoke about in hushed terms, if they spoke about them at all. You know, in history, right, or historiography, it's there's this tension between people that like to use, traditional first person, narratives, official documents that were written down saying that this happened and this happened, right? And the people that want to broaden the archive in the sense that we can draw history from places that are not typically viewed as historical, right? Like, for example, there probably isn't um, a, I think it said in this book, there isn't a detailed, written ledger by a slave master saying that I have a woman trapped in a house and I make her get bread every single year, and this is how many children she's produced, and I've sold them, and this. There's no ledger that we have found of a slave master doing that, right? But we know that this happened. We know that slave breeding happened because people spoke about it. It was passed on orally, like, hey, this is what used to happen, right? And also, it gets passed on through other forms of media. Maybe it's put into song. Maybe it's put into plays. Maybe it's put into novels, right? Maybe it's mentioned in the narratives of formerly enslaved people, but it's not a major part. Maybe it's one sentence here, one sentence there, right? So yeah, we could broaden the archive, and it becomes even more fascinating when you think about Carter G. Woodson, the man who essentially brought us like Black History Month, right? Is looking at this play and saying this is historical, in the sense that this play draws from so many real sources, right? The oral history of slave breeding in the South, puts it into one place, and does it now become a source of history? You get what I'm saying? This is a major question, right? And I pose this question to the audience, and I don't want to know what you think. Let me know what you think. Do you think, let's say 100 years from now, people look at a Kendrick Lamar album as a way of gauging history, right? Of events that happened in Black history. You get what I'm saying? Like, that's where they're drawn. That's the question of like, where does the archive stop and where does it begin? Is everything an archive? Is everything around us telling the story of history? Or can history only be told from a book that says this happened in the year 1904, right? And I'm writing this down because I saw it, I witnessed it, or I know somebody that saw it and witnessed it, and this is in my official book telling you what happened, right? You get what I'm saying? So anyway, continuing here. Breeders opens inside a slave cabin, its rough and old walls and dilapidated furniture setting a bleak scene. Mammy, a slave mother, sits amid the bleakness, consumed with her thoughts, her anxieties, and her inner grief. Mammy is middle-aged and graying. She looks older than her years, prematurely aged by a life of reproductive and physical labor, combined with psychological terror that Edmonds imagined was part of plantation life. In the opening scene, we learn that Mammy's grief and anxiety is a product of both past and present abuses. She gave birth to at least 3 slaves and has lived with a deep sadness since the sudden death of her children. Indeed, Mammy's pain is, in Edmund's rendering, reflective of the synergy between life and death in the mind's eye of the slave mother. Perhaps this is why Mammy is always praying, as she is in the bleak surroundings of Edmund's opening scene. Here, Mammy reflects sadly on the fate that befell 2 of her sons. We learn that Mammy's son recently tried to escape from slavery, captured by slave catchers as they strove to steal themselves to freedom. One of her sons was shot and killed, the other badly beaten and sold. Wiping tears from her eyes, Mammy recalls, "They both was good boys. They didn't mean to harm nobody." Mammy's daughter, Ruth, offers her mother little comfort in the melancholic opening scene, reflective of the terrorism of Jim Crow violence as much as the exploitative nature of slavery. Edmonds has Ruth convey the idea that whites view blacks as subhuman. "You know how the white folks feel," Ruth informs her mother. "Slaves is just slaves with them. They ain't supposed to have no feeling." Edmonds thus begins to unravel the connection between life and death in his rendering of African American folk culture. Mammy has presumably been a breeder as well as a domestic slave for her master. Yet the white people thought as little about killing her sons as they did in encouraging Mammy to bear them in the first place. Conscious of this, Ruth instructs her mother to stop crying because they is better off dead. Every slave is better off dead. Edmonds Breeders exhibits a profound sensitivity to the suffering of enslaved women. In the early 20th century, Black Americans remembered slave women like Mammy as the victims of the vilest and most terrifying abuses. And it is the exploited nature of Mammy, her ideally unfeeling, yet productive and reproductive function of the plantation, that prompts her to take flight from her conversation with Ruth and tend to her bread-making duties for the next day's guests. Mammy suspects that the mystery guest is a slave buyer, and she rushes to the big house to tend to her duties, leaving no time to come to terms with the depth of her loss. Instead, she feels ensnared in a complex web of slave-holding power and enslaved powerlessness, in which the nameless slave buyer will likely cause unspeakable pain for a mother the following morning. Mammy states sadly, they ain't told me his name yet, but I see show that some mammy be breaking her heart crying when he leaves, cause her child done gone. Okay, all right. They told me they all right. So they took her baby, and then she says they didn't tell me his name yet, but some but she'll be crying because that the child will never come back to her. Is how I'm interpreting that. It's so, maybe they should teach African American like English in high schools as a part of the English curriculum, right? Because it's very important to like read these plays and books and media that was created at the turn of the 20th century, because this is almost indecipherable for me. I am a native English speaker and I could barely read this. You get what I'm saying? Which goes to show how far, you know, we have come, I guess, as black folks. I don't know even how to interpret this, but this is hard as hell to read. I cannot read that. Okay, continuing here. What if, by the way, before I continue, what if like 1,000 years from now, like broken African American English is considered like high arts, high English? So people are saying they ate those show took my chillin'. Like, you get what I'm saying? Like people will say, oh, he speaks like Shakespeare. You get what I'm saying? I don't know. Anyway, I'll continue here. But something much worse than the unnamed slave traders' lust for profit is about to befall Mammy and Ruth. David, a slave on the plantation, is in love with Ruth. Ruth is unaware of David's feelings, but when Mammy leaves to tend to her domestic duties in the big house, David enters and dramatically declares his love. Reluctantly, Ruth returns David's feelings, but she confides that she has no intention of ever getting married and having children. The manipulative slave breeding practices imposed by slave owners and slave traders convince Ruth that death would be preferable to the type of emotional pain she sees her mother endure on a daily basis. She explains, I don't want to marry nobody and have chillins like Mammy so they could grow up and be whooped to death or sold down the river. I don't want to grief my heart out like Mammy. She doesn't want to have kids because she doesn't want them to go through pain. Edmonds highlights a depth of feeling and emotion among the female members of this enslaved family that is designed to emphasize the cruelly exploitative nature of Southern slave breeding practices. He does this abruptly, and as a result, with great theatrical power, a knock at the cabin door sees the plantation overseer enter. At his side is the slave Salem, a towering figure of a man. Salem is the plantation stud, and under orders from the plantation master, Salem is to take the 15-year-old Ruth as his wife, his 10th wife to be exact. Ruth, having just pronounced her love for David, who is now hiding to avoid the overseer's detection, wants nothing to do with Salem or her master's dehumanizing slave breeding schemes. Salem, however, is a determined man. His sense of masculinity, ordinarily circumscribed by the disciplinary boundaries of the plantation regime, is emboldened by his role as a plantation stud. Salem therefore insists that he will make Ruth like him, declaring of his 10 wives, I've been able to make them all satisfied, and they grow to like me too. Basically saying, the white man made him marry 10 other women, right? And, he was able to convince them to like him, or at least in his mind, he thinks all the women that he was forced to have sex with to make children for the slave master, that they actually like him. That's how he rationalizes it in his mind. This will be an interesting story, man. Somebody needs to read. This is in the public domain now, by the way. If this work was made in 1920, 1930, this is definitely in the public domain. So somebody could like revamp this story, make it into a fly-ass movie or miniseries. But y'all don't want to touch that, though. Are we still tired of slave movies and books? Are we still tired of slave movies and books? I know Will Smith's Emancipation flopped, and I ain't seen a slave movie since then come out. But some stories need to be told, and some of them could be more interesting than what we traditionally see. Anyway, having heard enough of Salem's boasting, David springs from his hiding place and confronts the plantation stud. But Salem is unmoved by David's professions of love for Ruth, mocking the much smaller David by referring to him as sexually impotent. Salem's words strike a bitter blow to David's masculine pride, and a vicious and violent struggle ensues, resulting in David's sudden and bloody death. Amid the scene of violence and grief, Salem remains true to his determination to make Ruth like him and, if necessary, use force to have sex with her that evening. Ruth, grief-stricken and terrified all at once, turns to Mammy, who has re-entered the cabin, and receives her mother's hard-bitten wisdom. In this world, Mammy instructs Ruth, black women ain't nothing but breeders, to have chillin' for the white folks to sell down the river like they do horses and cows. Ruth, unable to bear the thought of falling prey to the slave breeding system and all the grief she knows it will cause her, takes drastic action. In a moment of Shakespearean-like drama, Ruth reaches between her breast, reveals a vial of poison, and declares, I ain't going to be no breeder. I'm not going to be a breeder. She quickly consumes the poison and is soon lying on the floor awaiting death. As Ruth lies dying, Mammy prays the slave woman's lament. Stop it soon, Lord. Stop it soon and let your chillins drink the water of freedom and put on their garments of righteousness. Ruth chose death as her path to righteousness. She refused to be violated by Salem and resisted her master's orders that she bear children who would later be sold down the river for a profit. While life meant so much pain, death was the only freedom imaginable. So yeah, going back to Carter G. Woodson, watching this play at the time it came out, and he is a trained historian, and saying that this play is historic, right? Even though it was all from the mind of Edmonds, I can see why Carter G. Woodson would say this, because it draws from the real lived experiences of thousands, hundreds of thousands of black women that lived and never got to tell their story, but it's very similar to this. Think about like the movie Baby Boy, right? The movie Baby Boy with Tyrese and Ving Rhames, right? That is a fictional story, but it's a story all of us know. Some guy in the hood got a baby mama. He's living with his mama. He's not fully grown. And he's also a black man in this world dealing with racism and intercommunal violence and, not having job opportunities and prospects. Baby Boy is a culturally historic film, socially historic film, just as much as this story is, I would say, if that makes sense, if you follow where I'm coming from. It's like, they're drawing from real places, even though they are fully fictionalized, right? And I would say this is even more historic because Breeders is explicitly about, slave breeding that happened on plantations that we know happened. Because number one, how did we go from 100,000 black folks that were imported to the U.S., a 500,000 black folks, not 100,000, about 350,000, if I remember right. How do we go from 350,000 to 40 million people unless there was forced breeding and also massive rape of our people? You get what I'm saying? And also logically, it would have to make sense that people who viewed black people as property would want to reproduce their property and make more profit. That's capitalism in a nutshell. If you're able to make your car multiply so you can keep selling cars and it comes at no cost to you other than that car has to get jumped on by a big black dick. If that's all it takes for you to make another car to sell, then you're going to do that. Of course, that's what happened, right? But unfortunately, there are some people that denied that slave breeding existed, as we saw in other chapters, and also people that deny that it even happened today, right? Unfortunately. But let's continue here. We're at the conclusion section of chapter 4. Ralph Edmonds' Breeders was written to be more than entertainment for black audiences. It was written as history, written and performed in an era of intense racism, sexism, and widespread poverty. Edmonds' folk drama was history from the bottom up, a history about working people forced to labor and reproduce in the vilest context imaginable. Indeed, it was one's historical imagination that Edmonds hoped to ignite in those who read Breeders or saw productions of it throughout the country. And having sparked this historical imagination into action, readers or audiences would feel inspired to take political action to right the wrongs of the past, wrongs that felt so very real and ongoing to millions of Black Americans in the 1930s and 40s. For Edmonds, as many other African-American playwrights of his era, Black drama was much more than simply entertainment. It was a rich and diverse medium through which African-Americans could learn about their shared history. In slavery and in freedom, the memory and daily reality of rape, family separations, and lynching merged. For Black Americans, historical interpretations was as much a social commentary as a political statement. Perhaps the Black writers and playwrights of the 1920s and 30s were right. Maybe it was time to take a stand and fight once again for a new birth of freedom. Mamie's haunting words and breeders, Black women ain't nothing but breeders, captured the sense of degradation and sexual exploitation that African Americans associated with slavery and freedom, where books and wenches were objects of sexual exploitation during slavery. After slavery, the violence used to objectify Black Americans as horses and cows was redirected towards the brutal control and at times destruction of African American life. Embedded within the narrative layers of Black theatrical writing then was an inescapable dualism, the struggle for life and against premature death. The bookends of life, birth, and death that white Americans took for granted harbored historical and political meanings for African Americans that had been born in the dark void of slavery times and perpetuated in freedom by segregation laws, white male rapists of Black domestics, and lynch mobs. While many Blacks tried, it was hard to forget slavery. Playwrights like Randolph Edmonds and Mary Barrow refused to ignore the images of slave women being sexually violated, children torn from families and Black bodies hanging from trees. For former slaves in early 20th century America, such imagery was more than a defining part of a collective historical imagination. It was a life they had once lived, witnessed, and tried so hard to forget. In the depths of the Great Depression, these memories were awoken and relived in the minds thanks to the prodding of federal government employees. The narrative of former slaves that employees of the Works Project Administration collated would, in time, add new interpretive layers to the way slave reading was and is remembered. So that was a very interesting chapter. I really enjoyed jumping back on here for a book react. Gonna be reading chapter 5 tomorrow, and I believe there's only about 4 more chapters in this book to read. So we have 5, 6, 7, and 8, maybe an epilogue as well. So we're going to be finishing this book possibly by Monday at the latest. And then we're going to be continuing with another book in the series. It's about racism in Europe, the history of racism in Europe, written by a white man, so nobody can refute it because, you know, white people don't lie. So look forward to that. And yeah, once again, Dope Book by Gregory D. Smithers. A lot I had to say I already said already. So watch this in the playback and let me know what other books you think might be interesting for us to read here on Livestream. And stay tuned for more content. My name is Simon Hill.